Hello and welcome to Beauty by Jen. I hope you guys are having an awesome day wherever you are in the world, day or night. Let's get into some interesting topics.
Welcome to the Beauty by Jen channel. Today, we're delving into a compelling story. Jane Doe's 14-page document against Sean Combs. The alleged victim, who asserts she was merely 17 at the time, brings forth shocking claims. Join us as we dive straight into these revealing documents. Be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel. We are on our way to 6.5K, 1 United States District Court, Southern District of New York. Ex-Jane Doe, civil case no plaintiff, complaint v. Jury trial demands Sean Combs, Harve Pierre, the third assailant, Daddy's House Recordings, INC, and Bad Boy Entertainment Holdings Inc. Defendants. X. Plaintiff Case 1. 23 CV 10628 Document 1. Filed June 23, 12 Page 1 of 14 Trigger warning. This document contains highly graphic information of an exual nature including exual assault. Plaintiff Jane Doe, Miss Doe, hereby alleges as follows. Preliminary statement. On November 16, 2023, Cassandra Ventura, a Cassie, filed a 35-page lawsuit in which she exposed Sean Combs for subjecting her to nearly a decade of physical, exual, and emotional abuse, punctuated by rape, trafficking, and being forced to engage in drug-fueled, non-consensual, exual encounters with other men. Ordinarily, when a lawsuit such as Miss Ventura's is filed that involves events that took place long ago, witnesses are few and far between and evidence hard to muster. Not so for the claims brought against Mr. Combs. Within minutes of the filing, salient facts of Miss Ventura's claims were confirmed by various witnesses, including a rival musician whose car Mr. Combs blew up, as well as various individuals who observed Mr. Combs beat Miss Ventura. Page 2 of 14. Only a few days later, 2 other lawsuits were filed against Mr. Combs. In one, plaintiff Joy Dickerson Neal alleged that Mr. Combs drugged and exually assaulted her when she was a college student. The other lawsuit accused Mr. Combs and singer Aaron Hall of forcing the plaintiff and another unidentified woman into non-consensual sex. At the same time, a 4th lawsuit was filed, this one against Mr. Combs' companies and defendant Harve Pierre, the longtime president of Bad Boy Entertainment Holdings Inc., Bad Boy. The suit alleged that Mr. Pierre used his position of power at Bad Boy to groom and actually assault his former assistant, and that Bad Boy looked the other way at the time. This is now the 5th lawsuit filed against Mr. Combs in the last 3 weeks. Incredibly, the allegations brought by Miss Doe are in many ways even more egregious than those brought by his prior victims. Specifically, in 2003, when she was only 17 years old and in the 11th grade, Miss Doe was trafficked and gang-raped by Mr. Combs, Mr. Pierre, and the third assailant. In short, when she was just a teenager, Miss Doe met Mr. Pierre and the third assailant in a lounge in the Detroit, Michigan area. While at the lounge, Mr. Pierre insisted that he was best friends with Mr. Combs, and even called Mr. Combs with Miss Doe. Mr. Combs convinced Miss Doe, who was half his age at the time, to accompany Mr. Pierre and the third assailant on a private jet to come to his studio in New York City. Before they left for the private jet, Mr. Pierre smoked crack cocaine in a bathroom at the lounge, in which he also exually assaulted Miss Doe by forcing her to give him oral X. Page 3 of 14. Mr. Pierre, third assailant, and another gentleman then escorted the high schooler to a private jet, which flew them to Teterboro, New Jersey. There were SUVs awaiting the group at Teterboro, and the 4 of them were driven to Daddy's House Recording Studio, a studio famously owned and operated by Mr. Combs and Bad Boy. While at the studio, Mr. Combs and his associates, including Mr. Pierre, plied Miss Doe with drugs and alcohol. As the night wore on, the 17-year-old Miss Doe became more and more inebriated, eventually to the point that she could not possibly have consented to having sex with anyone, much less someone twice her age. While at the studio, Miss Doe was gang-raped by Mr. Combs, the third assailant, and Mr. Pierre, in that order. While Mr. Combs was graping Miss Doe, he complained that he could not get off unless she pinched his nipples as hard as she could. Mr. Combs then watched on as third assailant, who Miss Doe had not even realized had begun to have sex with her, graped Miss Doe as she told him to stop. After third assailant was finished, Mr. Pierre took his turn at graping Miss Doe, and then violently forced her to give him oral X, during which Miss Doe was choking and struggling to breathe. When Mr. Pierre finished, he left Miss Doe in the bathroom alone. Miss Doe fell into the fetal position and lay on the floor. Her vagina was in pain. Finally, after a period of time, Miss Doe regained her bearings. However, she could barely stand up following the gang rape, and had to be helped to walk out of the building and back into a car. She was taken back to an airport and flown back to Michigan. Page 4 of 14. Unlike many victims who have come forward after decades, Miss Doe can prove that she not only met Mr. Combs on the night in question, but was in his studio, in New York City, with him on that night. Remember when viewing these? Miss Doe was 17 years old. Miss Doe has lived with her memories of this fateful night for 20 years, during which time she has suffered extreme emotional distress that has impacted nearly every aspect of page 5 of 14, her life and personal relationships. Given the brave women who have come forward against Mr. Combs and Mr. Pierre in recent weeks, Miss Doe is doing the same. To that end, Miss Doe brings this action seeking injunctive, declaratory and monetary relief against defendants in violation of the Victims of Gender-Motivated Violence Protection Law, Gender-Motivated Violence Act, NYC Admin, Code Section 10, 1101 etc., VGM VPL, Jurisdiction and Venue. The court has jurisdiction over this matter pursuant to 28 U.S.C. Section 1332, as this action involves citizens of different states, and the amount in controversy in this matter exceeds $75,000. The court has supplemental jurisdiction over plaintiffs' related claims arising under state and city law, pursuant to 28 U.S.C. Section 1367, A. Pursuant to 28 U.S.C. Section 1391, B. Venue is proper in this court because a substantial part of the events or omissions giving rise to this action, including the unlawful employment practices and intentional and negligent tortious conduct alleged herein, occurred in this district. Parties. Plaintiff Jane Doe is a citizen of Canada. Defendant Sean Combs is a citizen of the state of California. Defendant Harve Pierre is a citizen of the state of New York. Defendant, the third assailant, is, upon information and belief, a citizen of the state of New York. Defendant Daddy's House Recordings Inc., Daddy's House, is a music, media, and entertainment company founded and owned by defendant Sean Combs. Daddy's House is page 6 of 14 incorporated and headquartered in New York, New York. During the relevant time period, Daddy's House and/or Sean Combs owned and operated the Daddy's House recording studio wherein Miss Doe was raped by Mr. Combs, Mr. Pierre, and third assailant. Defendant Bad Boy Entertainment Holdings Inc., Bad Boy, is a music, media, and entertainment company founded and owned by defendant Sean Combs. Bad Boy is incorporated and headquartered in New York, New York. During the relevant time period, Bad Boy and/or Sean Combs owned and operated the Daddy's House recording studio, wherein Miss Doe was raped by Mr. Combs, Mr. Pierre, and third assailant. Factual allegations. In 2003, Miss Doe was a 17-year-old 11th grader residing in a suburb of Detroit, Michigan. At the time, Mr. Combs was 34 years old, twice the age of Miss Doe, and one of the most well-known and influential music artists of all time. A decade earlier, Mr. Combs founded Bad Boy and installed his longtime friend Mr. Pierre into the role of president. At the time, Mr. Combs had many connections to Michigan, including, among others, to the Black Mafia family, BMF, a drug trafficking and money laundering organization that is rumored to have seeded Bad Boy. Accordingly, upon information and belief, Mr. Combs' associates, including Mr. Pierre and the third assailant, spent significant time in and around Detroit, Michigan. On one evening between the spring and fall of 2003, Miss Doe was out with friends. It was not uncommon for her and her friends to frequent bars and lounges in the Detroit area. Certain of Miss Doe's friends were well connected with people in the music industry. Page 7 of 14. On the evening in question, Miss Doe was with friends in a lounge when she was approached by who she later learned was Mr. Pierre. Mr. Pierre was with his own friends, including the third assailant. Mr. Pierre, the third assailant, and their friends were dressed in suits. Mr. Pierre repeatedly complimented Miss Doe's appearance, saying that she was hot, among other things. He then began talking about his self-described best friend and brother, Mr. Combs. Specifically, Mr. Pierre continually stated that Mr. Combs would love to meet Miss Doe. Mr. Pierre even called Mr. Combs and put Miss Doe on the line. Mr. Combs told Miss Doe that he would love to meet her, and that she should accompany Mr. Pierre to New York City in a private jet. Shortly thereafter, Mr. Pierre directed Miss Doe to go with him into the bathroom at the lounge. Once inside the bathroom, Mr. Pierre began to smoke crack cocaine from what appeared to be an aluminum can. After he finished smoking rack, Mr. Pierre suddenly took out his penis, demanded that Miss Doe suck his ick, and forced Miss Doe's head down to perform oral X on him. After exually assaulting Miss Doe, Mr. Pierre directed her to accompany him, the third assailant and a third member of their group, to an airport in Pontiac, Michigan, where Signature, a fixed-base operator, had prepared a private jet to take the four of them to New York City. Page 8 of 14, upon information and belief, the private jet landed at Teterboro Airport. Upon departing the jet, two black SUVs were awaiting the group. Miss Doe got into an SUV with Mr. Pierre, and the third assailant and the other member of the group went in the second SUV. The SUVs brought the group to Daddy's House Recording Studio, a recording studio and hangout owned and operated by Mr. Combs and Bad Boy. When Miss Doe arrived, she was escorted into the building, where she distinctly remembers seeing a sign for the company, Technicolor. Upon entering the studio, Miss Doe first encountered Mr. Combs. At the time she arrived, a female recording artist was using the studio as Mr. Combs and her parents watched on. She finished up shortly after Miss Doe arrived and left. While still in the studio section of Daddy's house, Mr. Combs asked Miss Doe to sit on his lap to take a picture. A copy of the photograph is below. Mr. Combs, Mr. Pierre and the third assailant began to ply Miss Doe, a 17-year-old child at the time, with copious amounts of drugs and alcohol. Page 9 of 14. While the evening became a blur, Miss Doe does recall Mr. Combs, Mr. Pierre and the third assailant hitting on her incessantly, stroking her body, asking to see her access, and telling her how hot and sexy she was. Various other pictures were taken in the studio that night, leaving no doubt that Miss Doe was in Mr. Combs' New York City studio with Mr. Combs on the night she was raped. As the night wore on, the 17-year-old Miss Doe became more and more inebriated, eventually to the point that she could not possibly have consented to having X with anyone, much less someone twice her age. Nevertheless, that evening Mr. Combs directed Miss Doe to accompany him to the bathroom at the studio. Once there, Mr. Combs removed Miss Doe's skirt and underwear and penetrated her from behind with his penis while she hung over the sink. Miss Doe did not consent to having sex with Mr. Combs, but he continued thrusting. At some point, Mr. Combs turned Miss Doe around to face him. He told her that he could not orgasm and asked her to squeeze his nipples as hard as she could to help him get off. He then turned her back around and continued to grape her. Page 10 of 14. By this point, Miss Doe was coming in and out of consciousness because of the drugs and alcohol she had been given by defendants. Her next memory was looking up into the mirror above the sink to find that the third assailant had replaced Mr. Combs and was graping her from behind. Mr. Combs was watching the third assailant sexually assault Miss Doe from a chair outside of the bathroom. At this point, Miss Doe mustered the energy to tell the third assailant to stop, and that she did not want to be having X with him. The third assailant did not stop and continued to grape Miss Doe, who did not have the strength to force him off of her. After the third assailant was finished, he was replaced by Mr. Pierre, who began by having non-consensual vaginal X with Miss Doe, before violently forcing her to give him oral X. During the latter part of the sexual assault, Mr. Pierre forced his penis into Miss Doe's mouth without her consent. Miss Doe remembers that Mr. Pierre was sweaty and that she had difficulty breathing. When Mr. Pierre finished, he left Miss Doe in the bathroom alone. Miss Doe fell into the fetal position and lay on the floor. Her vagina was in pain. Finally, after a period of time, Miss Doe regained her bearings. However, she could barely stand up following the gang rape, and had to be helped to walk out of the building and back into a car. She was taken back to an airport and flown back to Michigan. However, she has very limited recollection of her transport home and only remembers being in her car sometime early in the morning. Her underwear was missing. As a result of being graped by Mr. Combs, Mr. Pierre and the third assailant, Miss Doe suffered significant emotional distress and feels of shame that have plagued her life and personal relationships for 20 years. Page 11 of 14. Miss Doe knew that speaking out against defendants would be extremely difficult and that she would likely be subjected to retaliation and defamatory slurs and attacks. However, in November 2023, Miss Doe read about a lawsuit filed against Mr. Combs by Cassandra Ventura, aka Cassie. Miss Ventura's suit described a decade of physical, exual and mental abuse. Most triggering for Miss Doe was reading about Miss Ventura's allegations of X trafficking and being forced to have X with other men against her will. Miss Doe obviously understands that she too had been ex-trafficked, and that Mr. Combs's behavior in forcing women into non-consensual X was not an isolated incident or unique only to Miss Ventura. Then, just days later, Miss Doe read about a case filed against Mr. Pierre. The suit alleged that Mr. Pierre used his position of power at Bad Boy to groom and sexually assault his former assistant. Seeing two other women bravely speak out against Mr. Combs and Mr. Pierre respectively, gave Miss Doe the confidence to tell her story as well. As such, she files this suit. First cause of action: violation of the Victims of Gender-Motivated Violence Protection Law, NYC Admin. Code Section 10, 1101 et CQ, VGM VPL, against all defendants. Plaintiff repeats and realleges each and every allegation in all of the preceding paragraphs as if fully set forth herein. The above described conduct of defendant Mr. Combs, including but not limited to Mr. Combs's sexual assault of plaintiff in New York City, constitutes a crime of violence against plaintiff and is a crime of violence motivated by gender, as defined in Section 1103. The term crime of violence means an act or series of acts that would constitute a misdemeanor or felony against the person as defined in state or federal law, or that would constitute a page 12 of 14 misdemeanor or felony against property as defined in state or federal law if the conduct presents a serious risk of physical injury to another, whether or not those acts have actually resulted in criminal charges, prosecution, or conviction. And the term crime of violence motivated by gender means a crime of violence committed because of gender or on the basis of gender, and due, at least in part, to an animus based on the victim's gender. The above described conduct of defendant Mr. Pierre, including but not limited to Mr. Pierre's exually assault of plaintiff in New York City, constitutes a crime of violence against plaintiff and is a crime of violence motivated by gender, as defined in Section 1103. The term crime of violence means an act or series of acts that would constitute a misdemeanor or felony against the person as defined in state or federal law, or that would constitute a misdemeanor or felony against property as defined in state or federal law if the conduct presents a serious risk of physical injury to another, whether or not those acts have actually resulted in criminal charges, prosecution, or conviction. And the term crime of violence motivated by gender means a crime of violence committed because of gender or on the basis of gender, and due at least in part to an animus based on the victim's gender. The above described conduct of defendant the third assailant, including but not limited to the third assailant's exually assault of plaintiff in New York City, constitutes a crime of violence against plaintiff and is a crime of violence motivated by gender, as defined in Section 1103. The term crime of violence means an act or series of acts that would constitute a misdemeanor or felony against the person as defined in state or federal law, or that would constitute a misdemeanor or felony against property as defined in state or federal law if the conduct presents a serious risk of physical injury to another, whether or not those acts have actually resulted in criminal charges, prosecution, or conviction. Page 13 of 14. Violence motivated by gender means a crime of violence committed because of gender or on the basis of gender, and due, at least in part, to an animus based on the victim's gender. Defendant Bad Boy Entertainment Holdings Inc. enabled defendant's commission of the crime of violence motivated by gender, and is therefore also liable under the VGM VPL, as a direct and proximate result of the aforementioned crime of violence and gender-motivated violence. Plaintiff has sustained and will continue to sustain monetary damages, physical injury, pain and suffering, and serious psychological and emotional distress, entitling her to an award of compensatory and punitive damages, injunctive and declaratory relief, attorney's fees and costs, and other remedies as this court may deem appropriate damages, as set forth in Section 1104. The above described conduct of defendants constitutes a sexual offense as defined in Article 130 of the New York Penal Law. Pursuant to Section 1105a, this cause of action is timely because it is commenced within 2 years and 6 months after September 1st, 2022. Prayer for relief. Wherefore plaintiff prays judgment be entered in her favor against defendants, and each of them as follows. A. For a money judgment representing compensatory damages including consequential damages, lost wages, earning, and all other sums of money, together with interest on these amounts according to proof. B. For a money judgment for mental pain and anguish and severe emotional distress, according to proof. C for punitive and exemplary damages according to proof. Page 14 of 14D for attorney's fees and costs. E for prejudgment and post-judgment interest. And F for such other and further relief as the court may deem just and proper. Dated December 6, 2023, New York, New York, respectfully submitted, Wigdor LLP. Today, we've reviewed the comprehensive 14-page lawsuit presented by Jane Doe's attorney. The thoroughness of the filing suggests substantial evidence backing her claims. Sean Combs swiftly settled with Cassie previously, prompting curiosity about his response to Jane Doe's allegations. These are weighty accusations against him and his team. The collective stance taken by Cassie and the other purported victims sets a precedent, signaling a challenging path ahead for Sean Combs. While it's uncertain how this will unfold, it's crucial not to preempt the outcome. If proven true, appropriate consequences should follow for him and his team, perhaps even financial restitution. Your thoughts on this matter are valuable, so please share in the comments below. Stay tuned for further updates. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.